This is a photograph of a child worker who was one of 102 found working at a meatpacking plant in the US. And the sad part is that this is not a unique story. Since 2015, the number of minors employed in violation of child labor laws has increased by 472% in the US. It's been becoming like a bigger and bigger problem every year for the last decade or so. These kids are not doing summer jobs or babysitting. They're working in slaughterhouses with explosives and with dangerous chemicals as well. And when most of us think of child labor, we probably think of a Victorian factory or we think of a modern day sweatshop. But it's becoming a phenomenon that's affecting more and more wealthier nations. To make things worse, a number of states have passed laws to weaken child labor protection. In 2023, more states passed laws to weaken child labor protections than to strengthen them. And most recently, Louisiana voted to remove lunch breaks from child workers on the grounds that it was supposedly an overreach of government power. But when you look at who actually sponsored this bill, it paints quite a different story as to what's going on here. This bill was sponsored by a representative called Roger Wilder, and completely unrelated, this person also owns a bunch of Smoothie King franchises. When asked whether this would harm children, this was his response. The wording is, "We're here to harm children. Give me a break," he said. These are young adults. And the sad part is that this guy is one of many lawmakers who's actively pushed towards weakening child labor restrictions. And Louisiana is far from the only state. Arkansas, for example, has passed a bill to allow 14 and 15-year-olds to no longer show ID before they could work. America figured out quite a while ago that child labor was a bad thing. In 1938, they passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was a huge, overwhelming piece of legislation that restricted working hours, that introduced overtime pay, introduced the right to a minimum wage, and prohibited the employment of minors in what was called oppressive child labor. And we have to ask ourselves, what would lead a country almost 100 years later to roll back what was deemed pretty fundamental protections around child labor? One common reason that you'll see here is the fact that there is a labor shortage in a number of industries in the US. The US has been experiencing for a while now what's been described as a tight labor market, which is when unemployment is relatively low and people don't move jobs very frequently. This can make it really hard for certain industries to hire. Construction and agriculture are two industries that are facing incredibly high levels of labor shortage. However, it's worth mentioning that labor shortages aren't really real. Aside from a few industries that have highly specialized skills, where it can be extremely difficult to find someone who's adequately trained, the labor shortage is often simply a salary shortage, right? People aren't being offered enough of a wage to find the job appealing. And it turns out that hiring kids has quite a lot of benefits for a corporation. So you're probably familiar with, the minimum wage idea, but I don't know how many of you are familiar with the sub-minimum wage. The US and a number of other countries have this concept of a sub-minimum wage. Certain classes of workers can legally be paid below the minimum wage. This idea of a sub-minimum wage has led to some disabled workers in the US being paid less than $1 an hour to do work that is ultimately profitable for private companies. Kitty Cat says, I know waitresses can be paid way less. Yeah, so waitresses' pay is $2 an hour, and the rest is expected to be made up by tips. If the tips don't make up the difference, then the employer does have to fill the gap. However, in the case of the sub-minimum wage, employers are under no such obligation to fill the gaps. Children are another group of people who can often fall into this group of sub-minimum wage employees. The sub-minimum wage is something that was defined in this Fair Labor Standards Act, this law 86 years ago that outlawed most forms of dangerous child labor. And it includes provisions like youth under 20 can be paid as little as $4.25 per hour for the first 90 days of their employment, independent of whether those 90 days of your job are actually training days. Full-time students who are working can be paid 85% of minimum wage when they're employed in retail or service, in agriculture, or in institutes of higher education. Some states have even stronger provisions. For example, in Maryland, if you are under 16 and you work less than 20 hours a week, then you have no minimum wage protection. This isn't just a historical quirk, though. This isn't like a leftover from this act that was passed back in the 1930s, because still today, there are active efforts to make it even worse in different parts of the US. We can take Virginia, for example. Just last year, they tabled a bill that would allow workers under 18 to be paid $3 less per hour. And this was only struck down due to massive counter-protest, and ultimately this legislation didn't pass. But this is as recently as last year, there have been states who have been trying to introduce or strengthen sub-minimum wages in order to have even cheaper labor. The thing is, companies are quite strongly incentivized to violate these laws because the punishments are really, really lax. So the minimum punishment for a child labor violation is in Idaho, where the fine is $50 per violation. And at the top end, we have Delaware, where it's $10,000 per violation. And in South Carolina, they actually don't even have a monetary fine for the first violation. You get off with a written warning. These laws are like really behind the times, basically, and they do very little to disincentivize hiring kids. On a national level, there is actually like a maximum limit on how much a company can be fined per child labor violation. So the maximum federal limit is $15,000 per violation, which is actually, less than a year's wages for an adult employee. So you don't have to get away with it for very long. In my opinion, this is just a broader manifestation of the US's and, much of the world's addiction to cheap labor. For example, the 13th Amendment enshrines the right to enslave prisoners. And it has led to a setup now where US prison workers make $11 billion of goods and services every year and can also be paid a sub-minimum wage. The US also has the world's largest prison population. And, those two facts aren't unrelated. You might think, what would possess a lawmaker, a representative, a governor, a senator, whatever, to actively weaken child labor protections? And, as usual, it comes down to corporate political action. It comes down to lobbying. And I want to tell you about one specific lobby group that is one of the biggest driving forces behind all of these laws being passed. The Foundation for Government Accountability. They've hired 115 lobbyists across the US and have a presence in 22 states now. In Arkansas, they literally wrote the bill that was passed to allow 14 and 15-year-olds to no longer show ID before they could work. And the vice president of this lobby group claimed that the push for this reform didn't come from big businesses. It apparently came from families and parents who wanted more freedom to let the children flourish. And this would be plausible if it wasn't for the fact that this lobby group quite literally wrote the law. They wrote the bill and sent it. Like it says, lobbying is such a funny way of saying bribery. Yeah, lobbying is very much legalized bribery. And the marketing for these bills is always done under the guise of parents' freedoms. And yet the outcome always seems to be children working in increasingly dangerous occupations and in increasingly dangerous industries. Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that their children are never going to have to work in a meatpacking plant or work with explosives. To the corporate world, the child labor market is viewed as simply like an untapped source of cheap labor, and sub-minimum wages make it a very, very attractive option for lobbyists and a place where the companies that fund these lobbyists can get a massive return on investment. One such person who funds these lobbyists is the billionaire Charles Koch, the CEO of the second largest private company in the US. And him and his brother spent millions and millions and millions of dollars over decades trying to support various political causes. They have sponsored think tanks that have published articles like a case against child labor prohibitions or work is a gift that our kids can handle. And they have led an active effort to weaken child labor laws. And this has nothing to do with the fact that their companies work in manufacturing and chemical processing and would hugely benefit from this. They've also got a hand in with the Supreme Court in the US. So this is one of the brothers with Clarence Thomas, who is a Supreme Court justice. And he has attended many of their donor summits, which are invite only and typically reserved to donors who give over $100,000 a year to their political causes. They have hands in with the highest level of US lawmakers. Now, for a lot of people, they might question, is child labor that bad? Maybe they worked as kids, maybe you worked as kids and, turned out fine. The first thing I would say is, did you turn out fine? A lot of people think they turned out fine, but upon further investigation, have a lot of issues. And I also worked as a kid, right? I worked for several years as a kid while I was doing my exams. But in an ideal world, I would really like for us to recognize the fact that education is a form of work. There is so much documented research around the impact of working on kids. I read this one paper most recently, and the main finding of this paper was that youth employment is a big driver of dropout rates, likely because of a reassignment of priorities effectively. To a 15 or 16-year-old, being paid $8 an hour is life-changing money. And a lot of them won't necessarily have the foresight to understand that they're sacrificing their lifetime income for a quick bag. The aggressive push towards the rollback of these laws is not done in an effort to strengthen parents' rights. It's done in an effort, as these things often are, to advance corporate interests. Often when I see people push for this idea of children, learning skills through work, I always ask myself why such skills couldn't be learned through the education system. Why there isn't a push for the education system to be set up in a way that can achieve these same outcomes without requiring kids to do, backbreaking or mentally soul-destroying labor. Because if any of you have worked in, say, fast food or retail, you know the psychological impact that can have on you if you don't have a good work environment. It's a devaluation of downtime, of daydreaming and fantasy. And by forcing children to work, we're effectively just stifling the parts of childhood that end up being the most meaningful to these kids. All I'll say is that anytime you hear a politician speak about protecting the kids, ask yourself whether that's actually true, because it's very easy to market things that advance corporate interests as being done in the interest of children's freedoms or children's protections. And it's rare that that's the case.